in the sprawling metropolis of New Haven, where glass towers pierced the sky like crystalline spears and the underground fight circuits pulsed with raw violence, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before a room full of skeptical faces. The fluorescent lights of conference room 7B cast harsh shadows across the mahogany table where 12 men in expensive suits sat, their expressions ranging from barely concealed amusement to outright disdain. Her presentation slides flickered on the wall-mounted screen, displaying neural pathway diagrams and behavioral analysis charts that represented 3 years of her life's work. Psychological warfare, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of their collective doubt. The ability to read microexpressions, predict behavioral patterns, and manipulate emotional responses. This is the weapon of the future. Her fingers traced the edges of her tablet, the device containing algorithms that could decode human intention faster than conscious thought itself. Marcus Sterling, the head of the Defense Contractor Selection Committee, leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been truly challenged. His steel grey hair was perfectly styled. His designer watch caught the light as he gestured dismissively. Dr. Vasquez, with all due respect, we're looking for real weapons. Tanks. Missiles. Something that can actually win wars, not parlor tricks. The chuckles that rippled around the table felt like needles against her skin. Elena's dark eyes remained fixed on the screen, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that spoke of predatory focus rather than defensive retreat. Gentlemen, the most dangerous predator in any ecosystem isn't the one with the biggest teeth or the strongest claws. It's the one that understands the psychology of its prey. James Crawford, a former military contractor with arms crossed like a fortress against new ideas, snorted. Psychology doesn't stop bullets, Doctor. No, Helena agreed, her lips curving in what might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. But it prevents wars from starting. It ends conflicts before blood is spilled. It turns enemies into allies and transforms the battlefield into something the opponent never sees coming. She clicked to her next slide, showing brain scans during decision-making processes. This technology can predict human behavior with 94.7% accuracy. It can identify potential threats, terrorist cells, enemy strategies, all through psychological profiling and emotional manipulation. The room fell quiet for a moment. The kind of silence that precedes either breakthrough or breakdown. Harrison Phillips, the oldest member of the committee, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and peered at the data. The numbers are impressive, I'll grant you that. But how do we weaponize it? How do we deploy psychology in the field? Elena's presentation had been building to this moment for months. Every rejection, every condescending smile, every time someone had dismissed her work as soft science, had fed into this singular opportunity. We don't deploy it, Dr. Phillips. We deploy someone who embodies it. Someone who can read a room like a book, who can manipulate group dynamics, who can turn an enemy's own instincts against them. You're talking about a person, not a weapon system, Sterling interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. I'm talking about both, Elena replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A technique she had learned from studying interrogation methods. The room leaned forward, almost unconsciously, to hear her. The weapon isn't the technology. The weapon is the person who wields it. Someone who has learned to read human nature so completely that they become predator rather than prey. The silence stretched longer this time. Elena could read the micro-expressions flickering across their faces, Crawford's slight frown of consideration replacing his earlier dismissal, Phillips's fingers tapping in the rhythm of active thought, Sterling's jaw tightening as his certainty began to crack. She had spent years learning to see these tells, to understand the moment when doubt transformed into possibility. And where, Sterling asked slowly, would we find such a person? Elena's smile this time was genuine, predatory, and absolutely certain. You're looking at her. The months that followed that meeting were a blur of psychological evaluations, background checks, and training sessions that pushed Elena beyond every limit she thought she possessed. The committee had been skeptical but intrigued enough to approve a trial run. A single mission to test whether her theories could translate into practical results. They had given her access to classified intelligence networks, psychological profiles of international targets, and resources that most researchers could only dream of. But they had also given her something else. The complete underestimation of her capabilities. Elena had always been an observer. Even as a child growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East Haven, she had learned that survival meant reading the room before speaking, understanding which teachers would respond to intellectual curiosity and which would punish it, knowing which bullies could be reasoned with and which had to be outmaneuvered entirely. Her parents, both immigrants who worked double shifts to keep food on the table, had taught her that intelligence was her greatest asset, but they had also taught her to hide it when necessary. Medical school had been different. There, intelligence was expected, even celebrated. Elena had excelled in neuroscience, fascinated by the intersection of brain chemistry and human behavior. Her doctoral thesis on the neurological basis of decision-making had been groundbreaking enough to earn her positions at 3 different universities. But academia felt like a cage to someone who understood that real human behavior happened outside of laboratory conditions. The defense contract had seemed like an opportunity to apply her knowledge in the real world. What she hadn't anticipated was how much the real world would require her to become a different version of herself. The transformation began with physical training. Elena had always been in decent shape, but the program demanded something closer to peak physical condition. 6 months of intensive conditioning turned her lean frame into something harder, more dangerous. She learned hand-to-hand combat not because she expected to use it, but because understanding violence changed how she moved through the world. A person who knew how to hurt others carried themselves differently, and that difference was readable to anyone with the right training. More importantly, she learned to control every aspect of her physical presence. Micro-expressions became as manageable as breathing. Her posture could shift from submissive to dominant in milliseconds. Her voice could convey authority, vulnerability, seduction, or threat depending on what the situation required. She became a master of human psychology, not just in theory, but in practice. The weapon they had dismissed as soft science was reshaping itself into something far more formidable. 3 weeks before her first field assignment, Elena found herself in a different conference room with a different group of men, though their skepticism felt depressingly familiar. This time, however, she wasn't the one making presentations. Director Michael Hassan, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary within intelligence circles, was briefing her on the mission parameters. "The target is Viktor Kozlov," Hassan said, sliding a thick manila folder across the conference table. "Russian arms dealer with connections to at least 3 terrorist organizations. He's been supplying weapons to insurgent groups in the Middle East for the past 5 years, and every attempt to take him down through conventional means has failed." The folder contained photographs of a man in his early 50s, heavy-set with graying hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. Elena opened the file and began absorbing the information with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. Kozlov's psychological profile read like a textbook case study in narcissistic personality disorder combined with antisocial tendencies. He was intelligent but arrogant, suspicious but craving validation, surrounded by loyal subordinates but ultimately trusting no one completely. Most importantly, he had spent decades in a world where physical strength and traditional displays of power were currency. He would see her as either a potential conquest or a non-threat, both perspectives she could exploit. Previous operations against Kozlov have focused on infiltration, surveillance, and direct action, Hassan continued. All have failed because his security is too good and his paranoia too complete. He doesn't trust anyone he hasn't known for years, and he tests loyalty in ways that... Hassan paused, choosing his words carefully. In ways that make deep cover nearly impossible. Elena looked up from the file. "What's the objective?" "Information extraction," came the reply from Agent Sarah Chen, Hassan's second-in-command. "Kozlov has information about 3 major weapons shipments planned for the next 6 months. We need locations, timing, and buyer identities. Getting that information could prevent significant terrorist attacks in at least 2 countries. And the timeline? You have 6 weeks to make contact, gain his trust, and extract the information," Hassan said. "The weapons deals are happening whether we stop them or not. This is our window." Elena closed the file and looked around the room. These people were professionals who dealt in violence, coercion, and force as naturally as breathing. They understood her mission intellectually, but they didn't truly believe she could succeed where their traditional methods had failed. She could see it in their body language, the slight tension that suggested they were humoring a promising theory rather than deploying a proven weapon. "Where does he operate?" she asked. "Prague," Chen answered. "He's got a legitimate import-export business that serves as cover, plus connections throughout Eastern Europe. The city gives him access to both legal and illegal markets. And the corruption level makes traditional law enforcement approaches challenging. Elena nodded slowly. Prague was perfect for her purposes. A city where old-world charm masked new-world ruthlessness, where appearance and reality rarely matched, where someone skilled in psychological manipulation could thrive. Kozlov had chosen his base of operations well, but he had also chosen a battlefield that favored her particular skill set. "I'll need complete autonomy," she said. "No handlers, no check-ins, no backup unless I specifically request it. The moment you try to manage this operation from here, it fails." Hassan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Vasquez, you understand that you'll be completely on your own in a foreign country, attempting to manipulate one of the most dangerous arms dealers in Eastern Europe." "Director Hassan," Elena replied, her voice carrying an edge of steel that made everyone in the room pay attention. They thought her weapon was weak, but predator instincts know otherwise. "You're about to learn the difference between soft science and sharp execution." The flight to Prague gave Elena 12 hours to complete her transformation. By the time the plane touched down at Václav Havel Airport, Dr. Elena Vasquez no longer existed. In her place was Isadora Black, an art dealer from New York with connections to private collectors throughout Europe and a reputation for discretion when it came to pieces with questionable provenance. The identity had been crafted carefully, sophisticated enough to justify access to Kozlov's circle, morally flexible enough to make illegal connections plausible, and attractive enough to serve as either business partner or personal interest depending on how the situation developed. Elena, now Isadora, checked into a boutique hotel in Prague's historic district and spent her first 3 days learning the city like a predator learning new hunting grounds. She visited galleries, attended cultural events, and made herself known to the right people as someone with both taste and money. By the end of her first week, she had established herself as exactly the kind of person Viktor Kozlov did business with. The introduction came through Helena Moravkova, a gallery owner whose legitimate business occasionally served as a front for more questionable transactions. Elena had identified her through careful research as someone who connected Prague's art world to its criminal underworld. Exactly the bridge she needed to reach Kozlov. The meeting was arranged for a Friday evening opening at Moravkova's gallery, a showing of contemporary Russian artists that would draw precisely the crowd Elena needed to blend into. Elena arrived 15 minutes after the official start time, dressed in a way that balanced sophistication with accessibility. Her black dress was expensive but not ostentatious, her jewelry real but understated. She had learned that first impressions were everything in this world, and the impression she wanted to create was of someone worth knowing but not threatening to establish power structures. The gallery buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, the air thick with cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. Elena moved through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping to examine paintings while simultaneously cataloguing every person in the room. She identified Kozlov within minutes, not because she recognized him from photographs, but because she recognized the subtle deference pattern that surrounded him. People angled their bodies toward him when he spoke, maintained careful distances when he moved, and watched him with the mixture of respect and wariness that indicated dangerous charisma. She observed him for 30 minutes before making contact, learning the rhythms of his conversation, the way he commanded attention, the micro-expressions that indicated when his interest was genuine versus polite. Kozlov was everything the psychological profile had suggested: intelligent, arrogant, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He was also, Elena noted with predatory satisfaction, exactly the kind of man who would underestimate a woman until it was too late. Her approach was deliberately indirect. Instead of seeking introduction to Kozlov himself, she began a loud conversation with Moravkova about a particular painting, a discussion that demonstrated both her knowledge of art and her connections to wealthy collectors. Within minutes, Kozlov's attention had shifted to their conversation. Elena could feel his interest like a physical weight, but she continued her discussion as if unaware of his scrutiny. The bait was set. Now she had to wait for him to take it. Part 2. The Hunt. Viktor Kozlov approached Elena's position near a particularly striking abstract piece, a canvas dominated by deep reds and blacks that seemed to pulse with suppressed violence. She had positioned herself there deliberately, knowing from his psychological profile that he was drawn to art that reflected his own worldview. The painting's brutal beauty would serve as a perfect conversation starter for someone who dealt in controlled destruction. "Provocative choice," Kozlov said in accented English, his voice carrying the rough warmth of expensive whiskey. Elena turned toward him with a carefully calibrated expression of surprised pleasure, not startled, which would suggest weakness, but delighted, which would feed his ego. "I find most people are afraid of honest emotion in art," she replied, her eyes moving between his face and the painting. "They prefer their violence sanitized, their passion controlled. But this," she gestured toward the canvas, "this acknowledges that chaos and order are dance partners, not enemies." Kozlov's interest sharpened visibly. Elena had chosen her words precisely, speaking his language without appearing to know she was doing so. Arms dealers lived in the space between chaos and order, profiting from the tension between destruction and control. Her comments suggested philosophical alignment without claiming understanding of his particular profession. "You are art dealer, yes?" he asked, though Elena noted it was phrased more as confirmation than question. He had already done preliminary research, which meant her cover identity was working. "Among other things," Elena replied with a smile that suggested intriguing mysteries without promising specific revelations. "I help people find what they're looking for, whether they know exactly what that is or not." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of psychological maneuvering. Elena had spent years studying the art of influence, but this was the first time she was using those skills in a context where failure could mean her death. Every word was chosen for maximum impact, every pause calculated to create exactly the right level of intrigue. She presented herself as sophisticated but not intellectual, successful but not threatening, interested but not available. Most importantly, she made Kozlov work for her attention. When he asked about her business, she provided just enough information to seem legitimate while deflecting toward questions about his work. When he complimented her dress, she accepted gracefully but immediately shifted focus to the art around them. She was friendly without being flirtatious, impressive without being competitive, mysterious without being secretive. Within an hour, Viktor Kozlov was completely hooked. Elena could see the exact moment his interest shifted from casual to serious. It happened when she mentioned having recently brokered the sale of a collection that included pieces from questionable provenance to a collector who valued discretion above documentation. The comment was carefully designed to suggest she was comfortable operating in grey moral areas without claiming specific criminal connections. Kozlov's pupils dilated slightly, a micro-expression indicating increased arousal that could be either sexual or professional interest, and Elena suspected it was both. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Kozlov suggested, his hand moving to rest lightly on Elena's lower back, a test of boundaries that she allowed while filing the information away for future use. "I was thinking the same thing," Elena replied, turning toward him with a smile that suggested anticipation rather than compliance. "I know a wine bar that stays open late and has excellent acoustics for conversation." The choice of venue was crucial. Elena had spent days scouting locations looking for places that would serve her operational needs while appealing to Kozlov's sense of control. The wine bar she chose was upscale enough to match his standards, intimate enough to encourage personal conversation, but public enough that he would feel secure rather than trapped. Most importantly, it was a place where she could demonstrate sophistication while maintaining plausible deniability about any business discussions. They talked until nearly 3 a.m, covering everything from art to philosophy to the changing nature of international business. Elena revealed carefully curated details about her background. Enough truth to feel authentic, enough fiction to serve her mission requirements. She had grown up in New York, she told him, learned about art from her grandmother who had fled Europe during the war, built her business by understanding that some collectors cared more about acquiring beauty than questioning its origins. More importantly, she listened. Elena had learned that the key to manipulation wasn't talking people into things, it was getting them to talk themselves into things. She asked questions that encouraged Kozlov to reveal his worldview, his frustrations, his desires. She provided the kind of intelligent conversation that his position usually denied him, treating him as sophisticated rather than simply powerful. By the end of their first evening together, Elena had established herself as exactly what Viktor Kozlov hadn't known he was looking for. Someone who could match his intelligence, appreciate his complexity, and operate in his world without judging it. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced, personally or professionally. Kozlov pursued her with the same methodical intensity he applied to his business dealings, but Elena had to be careful to remain the hunter while appearing to be hunted. Every date was an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as romantic interest. Every conversation was a psychological chess match where she had to win without letting him know they were playing. 3 weeks into their relationship, Kozlov invited Elena to his private office above the import-export business that served as his legitimate front. The invitation was significant, a sign that he was beginning to trust her enough to show her aspects of his real life. Elena accepted with carefully controlled enthusiasm, knowing that access to his professional environment would provide invaluable intelligence about his operations. The office was exactly what she had expected from someone with Kozlov's psychological profile. Expensive but not flashy. Organized to demonstrate control without revealing vulnerability. Positioned to allow him to observe without being observed. What she hadn't expected was the security level. Getting to Kozlov's office required passing through 3 different checkpoints, each staffed by men who carried themselves like former military. The message was clear. Viktor Kozlov was a man who had made enough enemies to require serious protection. Impressive security, Elena commented as they settled into leather chairs overlooking Prague's historic skyline. Necessary precaution, Kozlov replied, pouring expensive vodka into crystal glasses. In my business, trust is luxury I cannot afford. Elena accepted the glass and took a careful sip, noting that Kozlov watched her reaction closely. The vodka was excellent, smooth enough to drink straight, expensive enough to impress. More importantly, accepting it was another test of trust that she needed to pass without appearing to recognize it as such. What business exactly? She asked with the casual curiosity of someone making conversation rather than conducting interrogation. Kozlov's laugh was genuine but careful. You have not asked before now. I assumed you would tell me when you wanted me to know, Elena replied, which was both true and strategically perfect. It demonstrated respect for his privacy while suggesting she was comfortable with ambiguity. Exactly the attitude someone in his position would find attractive. Import-export, he said, which was technically accurate if completely uninformative. I help people acquire things that are difficult to obtain through conventional channels. Elena nodded as if this explained everything while filing away the phrasing for analysis. Kozlov was clearly comfortable discussing his work in euphemisms, which suggested he had practice explaining his business to people who weren't directly involved in illegal activities. More importantly, his willingness to discuss it at all meant he was beginning to see her as potentially useful rather than merely entertaining. Sounds like my kind of business, Elena said with a smile. Though I imagine your clients have different taste than mine. Perhaps, Kozlov agreed, leaning forward slightly. What would you say if I told you I was considering expanding into your market? Art, antiques, items with complicated histories? Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression mildly interested rather than excited. This was potentially exactly the opening she needed. A way to become involved in Kozlov's operations while maintaining her cover as an art dealer. I would say that expansion requires local expertise, and that complicated histories often come with complicated risks. Risks that could be managed by someone with right connections and proper discretion. Kozlov suggested. Certainly, Elena agreed, though I would want to understand the full scope of any collaboration before committing to anything specific. It was the perfect response. Interested but cautious, professional but flexible. Elena could see Kozlov's approval and the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the way his smile became more genuine. She was passing every test he set, demonstrating exactly the combination of competence and reliability that would make her valuable to his organization. What Kozlov didn't realize was that every conversation, every test, every moment of growing trust was providing Elena with intelligence about his operations, his security measures, and his psychological vulnerabilities. She was learning the names of his associates, the patterns of his business meetings, the rhythms of his organization. Most importantly, she was mapping the intersection between his professional and personal lives, looking for the moment when his guard would drop enough for her to access the information her mission required. That moment came sooner than expected, triggered by an event that Elena later realized she should have anticipated but hadn't fully prepared for. 4 weeks into their relationship, Viktor Kozlov asked Elena to accompany him to a private dinner party hosted by one of his business associates. The invitation was presented casually, almost as an afterthought, but Elena recognized it immediately as a significant escalation. Meeting Kozlov's professional circle meant stepping deeper into his world, but it also meant increased scrutiny from people who had survived in the arms-dealing business by being excellent judges of character and intention. Elena accepted the invitation with appropriate enthusiasm while immediately beginning to prepare for what would essentially be a live audition in front of some of the most dangerous people in Eastern Europe. The dinner party would be her opportunity to solidify her position in Kozlov's life, but it would also be the moment when her cover identity faced its most serious test. The event was held at a private club in Prague's Vinohrady district, the kind of establishment that catered to wealthy individuals who preferred their luxury discreet rather than ostentatious. Elena arrived wearing a midnight blue dress that was elegant enough to fit the setting, while practical enough to allow quick movement if the evening went wrong. Her jewelry was real but modest, her makeup flawless but understated. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a successful art dealer, comfortable in sophisticated company. The guest list was a who's who of Eastern European organized crime, though Elena doubted any of them would have appreciated that description. They were businessmen, importers, collectors, and facilitators who happened to operate in markets that existed outside traditional legal frameworks. More importantly, they were people who had survived in dangerous professions by being excellent at reading others, which meant Elena's performance had to be absolutely flawless. She spent the cocktail hour moving through the group with careful precision, engaging in conversations about art, travel, and business while simultaneously gathering intelligence about each person's role in Kozlov's network. She identified his lieutenant, his financial advisor, his security chief, and his primary international contacts. Most importantly, she began to understand the power dynamics within his organization, who he trusted, who he relied on, who he was wary of. The dinner itself was an exercise in careful navigation. Elena was seated between Kozlov and Dmitry Volkov, a man whose legitimate timber business served as cover for smuggling operations throughout Central Europe. The placement was deliberate. Kozlov was showing her off to one of his most trusted associates, while positioning her to demonstrate her suitability for inclusion in their world. Volkov tested Elena almost immediately, asking pointed questions about her business, her background, her connections to various collectors and dealers. Elena had prepared for this level of scrutiny, but she also recognized that her answers were being evaluated not just for accuracy, but for attitude. These men weren't just checking her credentials. They were assessing whether she had the psychological makeup necessary to operate in their environment. Art dealing must require significant flexibility when it comes to provenance documentation, Volkov suggested during the main course, his eyes watching Elena's reaction carefully. Flexibility is essential in any business that deals with historical objects, Elena replied smoothly. Collectors are often more interested in beauty and rarity than in paperwork. My job is to help them acquire what they want while managing any associated complexities. And you are comfortable with such complexities? Volkov pressed. Elena's smile was perfectly calibrated, knowing without being arrogant, confident without being naive. Mr. Volkov, I have learned that moral absolutism is a luxury that most successful businesses cannot afford. I prefer to focus on results rather than methodology. The answer pleased both men, Elena could see. She had demonstrated sophistication about the moral ambiguities of their world without claiming to be more ruthless than she appeared. Most importantly, she had shown that she understood the fundamental rule of their business. Results mattered more than methods. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself drawn deeper into conversations about specific business opportunities. Kozlov's associates discussed upcoming deals in terms vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough to reveal operational details. Elena listened carefully, memorizing names, dates, and locations while maintaining the appearance of someone interested in general business philosophy rather than specific intelligence. By the end of the evening, she had gathered enough information to significantly advance her mission. But more importantly, she had passed the test. Viktor Kozlov's associates had accepted her as someone who belonged in their world, which meant she now had access to information that could prevent significant terrorist attacks while potentially dismantling one of Europe's most dangerous arms-dealing networks. What Elena didn't anticipate was how successfully infiltrating Kozlov's organization would force her to confront the fundamental question her mission had raised from the beginning. In becoming a predator sophisticated enough to hunt other predators, what part of herself was she willing to sacrifice? Part 3. The revelation 6 weeks into the mission. Elena had achieved something that traditional intelligence operations had failed to accomplish in 5 years. She had become indispensable to Viktor Kozlov's organization. Her art-dealing cover had evolved into genuine involvement in his business, brokering sales of antiquities and artwork that helped legitimize his more questionable activities. More importantly, she had gained access to the information her mission required. details about 3 major weapons shipments that could potentially arm terrorist organizations across 2 continents. But success had come at a cost she hadn't anticipated when she first walked into that conference room in New Haven. The woman who had entered Prague 6 weeks ago as Dr. Elena Vasquez was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more comfortable with moral ambiguity than she had ever imagined possible. The transformation that had begun as professional necessity was becoming something deeper and more permanent. Elena stood in her hotel room, looking out at Prague's medieval skyline while reviewing encrypted files on her laptop. The information she had gathered was comprehensive: shipping manifests, financial records, contact lists, operational timelines. Everything her handlers needed to prevent the weapons deals and potentially dismantle Kozlov's entire network. She could transmit the intelligence, extract herself from Prague, and return to her old life as an academic who had successfully proven her theories about psychological warfare. The problem was that she no longer wanted her old life back. The realization had been building for weeks, but it crystallized as she watched Kozlov prepare for a critical business meeting that would finalize the largest weapons deal of his career. She had positioned herself to observe the meeting through carefully placed surveillance equipment, ready to gather final intelligence before calling for extraction. What she saw instead was a man who had grown to trust her completely, who had shared aspects of his life and business that he revealed to no one else, who had begun to depend on her judgment in ways that went far beyond professional consultation. Viktor Kozlov was a criminal whose business facilitated violence and terrorism around the world. Elena knew this with perfect clarity and had never forgotten it for a moment. But he was also intelligent, sophisticated, and surprisingly vulnerable beneath his carefully maintained facade of control. More disturbing was the recognition that Elena had begun to enjoy the challenge of operating in his world, the intellectual stimulation of managing complex psychological manipulations, the sense of power that came from being able to read and influence dangerous people. She had become exactly the weapon she had promised to be. The question was whether she could still be anything else. The final test came during what should have been the mission's culminating moment. Kozlov had invited Elena to join him for the completion of his largest deal, a sale that would provide weapons to 3 different terrorist organizations and potentially result in hundreds of civilian deaths across multiple countries. Her presence wasn't operationally necessary, but Kozlov wanted her there as a sign of their growing partnership. For Elena, it represented the perfect opportunity to gather final intelligence while witnessing the completion of everything her mission was designed to prevent. The meeting took place in a private warehouse in Prague's industrial district, a location chosen for its isolation and defensibility. Elena arrived with Kozlov, noting the security arrangements, the participants' identities, and the specific details of the weapons being transferred. Everything was exactly as her intelligence had indicated, except for one crucial detail that changed the entire dynamic of her situation. Among the buyers was a man Elena recognized from classified briefings as Rashid al-Mansouri, the operational commander of a terrorist cell responsible for attacks that had killed over 300 civilians in the past 2 years. Seeing him in person, watching him examine weapons that would almost certainly be used to kill innocent people, Elena felt something shift inside her that went beyond professional obligation or personal transformation. For the first time since beginning the mission, she experienced genuine revulsion at what she was facilitating through her continued participation in Kozlov's organization. The meeting proceeded according to established protocol. Weapons were inspected, payments transferred, delivery schedules confirmed. Elena maintained her cover perfectly, playing the role of Kozlov's sophisticated business partner while mentally cataloging every detail that would allow her handlers to track and intercept the weapons shipments. But she could feel something changing in her psychological approach to the situation, a growing tension between the persona she had created and the person she had been before Prague. As the meeting concluded, al-Mansouri approached Elena with the kind of attention that immediately put her on alert. His interest was clearly personal rather than professional, and Elena recognized the danger of becoming memorable to someone whose survival depended on paranoid attention to potential threats. "Victor, you have excellent taste in associates," al-Mansouri said in heavily accented English, his eyes moving over Elena with obvious appreciation. "Perhaps we might discuss future collaborations that would benefit all parties involved." Kozlov's response was immediate and territorial, a subtle shift in posture that marked Elena as belonging to him rather than being available for other alliances. "Isadora works exclusively with my organization," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made al-Mansouri step back slightly. "But I appreciate your interest in expanding our business relationship." The exchange was brief, but Elena realized it had fundamentally changed her situation. She was no longer an observer documenting Kozlov's activities. She had become a recognizable figure in his organization, someone whose continued presence would be expected and whose sudden disappearance would raise immediate suspicions. More troubling was the recognition that Kozlov's protective response had been genuine rather than calculated, suggesting that his feelings toward her had evolved beyond professional utility into something more personal and therefore more dangerous. That evening, Elena sat in Kozlov's apartment while he celebrated the successful completion of his largest deal. The space was elegant but fortress-like, with security systems that rivaled government installations and artwork that had probably been stolen from museums. Kozlov poured champagne and talked about future plans that included expanding their business partnership into new markets and longer-term collaborations. Elena smiled and nodded and played the role of the sophisticated criminal perfectly, while mentally composing the message that would trigger the final phase of her mission. But when she accessed her secure communication system later that night, Elena found herself staring at a blank screen, unable to type the words that would end everything she had built in Prague. The information she had gathered was complete, accurate, and sufficient to prevent multiple terrorist attacks while potentially dismantling one of Europe's most dangerous arms-dealing networks. Transmitting it would represent the successful completion of her mission and her triumphant return to a world that had once dismissed her capabilities. Instead, Elena found herself thinking about transformation, not just her own, but the fundamental nature of what it meant to destroy one's weak self in order to become something stronger. The academic who had entered Prague 6 weeks ago had been brilliant but naive, sophisticated in theory but inexperienced in practice, confident in controlled environments but untested under real pressure. That woman had been weak not because she lacked intelligence or capability, but because she had never been forced to discover the full extent of what she was willing to become. The woman who sat in Viktor Kozlov's apartment planning the destruction of his organization while maintaining perfect emotional control was something entirely different. She was a predator who had learned to hunt other predators, someone who could navigate moral complexity without losing operational effectiveness, a weapon that had forged itself through necessity and choice rather than design and training. She was, Elena realized, exactly what she had always been capable of becoming. She had simply needed the right circumstances to reveal it. The decision, when it came, surprised Elena with its clarity and certainty. She transmitted her intelligence exactly as planned, providing her handlers with everything they needed to prevent the terrorist attacks and arrest key members of Kozlov's network. But she also sent a second message, a request for extended deep cover authorization and permission to continue her operation indefinitely. The response came within hours. Her handlers were delighted with the intelligence she had provided and the success of her mission, but they were also concerned about the psychological costs of extended undercover work. Elena's request was approved on a provisional basis, but with strict requirements for regular psychological evaluations and extraction protocols if her cover was compromised. What her handlers didn't understand was that Elena's request had nothing to do with operational necessity and everything to do with personal transformation. She had discovered that the process of destroying her weak self had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, and she wasn't ready to abandon that discovery in favor of returning to a version of herself that now seemed limited and incomplete. The arrests began 3 days later. Elena watched from Kozlov's apartment as news reports described coordinated raids across Eastern Europe targeting arms dealers and terrorist networks. She maintained perfect emotional control as Kozlov realized that someone had betrayed his organization, providing detailed intelligence that allowed authorities to intercept weapons shipments and arrest key associates. She offered comfort and support as he struggled to identify the source of the leak while maintaining his business operations under increased scrutiny. Most importantly, she began planning the next phase of her operation, one that would take her deeper into the criminal underworld while providing her handlers with intelligence about threats they had never imagined existed. Viktor Kozlov never discovered that his trusted partner and increasingly intimate companion had been responsible for the destruction of his network. Elena's cover remained intact. Her access to intelligence continued uncompromised, and her transformation into something harder and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated proceeded without interruption. She had proven that psychological warfare could be as devastating as any conventional weapon, but she had also proven something more personally significant. She had learned that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but she had also learned that the process of that destruction changes fundamental aspects of identity in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. The woman who emerged from Prague was undeniably stronger, more capable and more effective than the academic who had first proposed psychological warfare as a legitimate military strategy. But she was also someone who had discovered that true predatory instinct required a willingness to sacrifice conventional morality in favor of operational effectiveness. As Elena stood in her hotel room 6 months later, preparing for her next assignment in a different city with a different identity, she reflected on the irony of her situation. They had thought her weapon was weak because they had misunderstood what strength meant in her particular context. Physical force and conventional violence were blunt instruments compared to the precision of psychological manipulation. But the real revelation had been personal rather than professional, discovering that becoming an effective predator required abandoning the safe boundaries of who she had once been in favor of exploring the full range of who she was capable of becoming. Elena Vasquez, the academic, had been destroyed in Prague, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, and infinitely more effective. The woman who remained understood that strength came not from avoiding moral complexity, but from navigating it successfully, not from maintaining innocent idealism, but from embracing sophisticated realism, not from preserving a weak self, but from forging a strong one through deliberate choice, rather than circumstance. They had thought her weapon was weak, but predator instincts had known otherwise. The real predator had always been Elena herself. She had simply needed the right circumstances to reveal it, and once revealed, that predator had no intention of returning to the constraints of her former life. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and exactly what she had always been capable of becoming. The weak self had been destroyed not by others, but by the choice to become something stronger. And that choice, once made, had changed everything about what Elena understood strength to mean. 6 months later, in a different city with a different identity, Elena prepared for her next mission with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most dangerous weapon was not the one that appeared strongest, but the one that was consistently underestimated until it was far too late for its targets to defend themselves. The predator that had emerged from Prague was patient, sophisticated, and absolutely relentless in pursuit of its objectives. They would continue to think her weapon was weak until the moment they realized their mistake, and by then, she would have already won. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already eliminated the vulnerability that others would exploit. But he must also accept that the process of that destruction changes him in ways that cannot be undone, creating strength through the deliberate abandonment of who he once was in favor of discovering who he was always capable of becoming.